Hi everyone, Angus Campbell here. It's Wednesday the 25th of August 2021. And first of all, what I'd like to say is that we're filming again from the Isle of Islay. And thanks to those that have commented on passing on their best wishes to my father, because he is recovering well now and at home, and all is looking good. So many thanks to those people. Secondly, just to mention that with respect to some comments, I found there's a bit of a problem with YouTube whereby I'm not able to respond to some of them, because although I'm notified about them, I can't actually access them through YouTube. So my apologies if you're expecting a response and I've not responded. It's not because I haven't tried or I've ignored you, but there's a bit of a technical problem, I think, anyway. Now, moving on then. So what we're going to focus on today is the A70 Lightning. But you may have noticed that I've got two budding associates with me who live next door to my father on the Isle of Islay. So girls, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes.
What's your name?
Hi, I am Erin. I am Rachel.
Very good. And Erin and Rachel live here on Islay, and on Islay they still teach Gaelic. My father's first language is Gaelic, but I was born in England, and so I only know a little tiny bit. But these girls are being taught Gaelic, so we're going to introduce a bit of Gaelic occasionally in this video perhaps. So what we're going to do today, as I say, is focus on the oil pressure problems that I've got with the A70 Lightning. So earlier on, girls, we were talking about BSA. Do you remember what BSA stands for?
No.
Can you remember, Rachel? Okay. Birmingham Small Arms.
Oh.
And why is it called Birmingham Small Arms? What did they used to make originally?
Guns.
Guns. Yeah, absolutely right. Okay, so before we kick off then into the actual motorcycle clips, how do you say hello in Gaelic?
Martin.
Say it louder.
Martin.
Very good. And will you be able to say goodbye later on? How do you say goodbye in Gaelic?
You have no idea.
Pardon?
Forgotten.
You've forgotten?
You learned it, but I just forgot.
I see. Count to 10 for me in Gaelic. That was 11, was it? Very good.
Yes.
Right, before again we kick off, I've got a quick maths, a bit of mathematics for you.
Okay.
But you don't have to answer it just yet. So, how old are you, Erin?
7.
How old are you, Rachel?
9.
So, say on my channel I've got about 1,000 subscribers, and the average age is probably about 60 years old. So we're all old-ish. If we had 2 subscribers, one of which is 7 and one of which is 9, what's the average age of the channel now? You don't have to answer that yet. Right then, on to investigations. So, as we've said, we need to check that we've got a good oil supply, which we can assume was okay, but we'll just check that the oilways and channels are clear. But then we focus on 3 things: the oil pump, the oil pressure relief valve, and then the dear old time inside main bearing. So in preparation for that, the reason I've started on this side is because on the other side I've already got the covers off, and I'm only showing you part of that for a reason, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So I've got the outer and inner timing side cover off, and I've also removed the replacement oil pump. So let's start there. So as some of you may be aware, before the last test run I replaced the original This is an iron oil pump from late 71 onwards, probably 71 onwards actually. So these are known to be good pumps. But when we took this apart before the last test run, there didn't appear to be any signs of wear. But bearing in mind what this engine has been through, I thought it might be worthwhile investing in a new pump. SRM ones, you just can't find any stock of them at the moment at all. So I went the next best thing and went down the Hepalite route. They're quite expensive, but they're a faithful replica, but said to be manufactured and machined to greater tolerances than the original BSA iron pump. And all I was checking here with respect to this replacement pump was that I'd actually torqued this up properly, that the faces were all clean, the gasket was in correctly, and that the non-return valve was on the right side and inserted correctly, and that was all correct. So nothing wrong on the oil pump side, in my opinion. And bear in mind that when the bike starts up from cold, the oil pressure warning light goes out when you're kicking over vigorously, and on this bike, on the A70, oil pressure warning light switch is set to activate at £7, so reasonably high compared to the £5 of the early A65. So I think we can rule that side of it out. I think we can assume that this pump and probably that pump are both delivering well, and we demonstrated that when we primed this pump. You've just got to spin it and it spits oil out the feed side of it. So that's the pump side, and to be honest, when I rebuild this, I might go back to the original pump and sell this one off cheap, so look out for that. But anyway, let's move on then to a bit more meaty stuff where, as demonstrated and described within various forums, including the best one, which in my opinion is BritBike, we'll go into then the oil pressure relief valve, because there are a number of considerations with this, and there's another additional consideration with respect to the A70, so let's move on to that. Right, oil pressure relief valve in pieces. So these are all the components. So on these models, I'm not quite sure when they introduced the piston type, but certainly 71 onwards it was installed on the A65 and on the A70. Piston type rather than a ball bearing, and this is said to be more reliable with respect to sealing. Now on visual inspection, as stated before, nothing wrong with these components. That piston slides beautifully in the cylinder itself, and just to remind people that don't know, then oil pressure from the pump is fed down a channel past this gauze entry to the main bearing. So this is under pressure on this side, so pressure pushes against that piston and against the spring and against the end cap. Now what happens is, if the pressure exceeds the maximum, then the piston is depressed to the right in that direction, and these holes, drain holes, are then exposed so that excess oil is fed back to the pump through these holes. And you can see there's a channel around this. So there's two exit points on this, but then around this channel it goes out on one side back to the oil pump feed side, I believe. Now, first thing to check then was that obviously the piston is moving freely within the cylinder, and it is. But there's another problem that is quite well documented with these, and that is that obviously when this is installed,
this channel should line up accurately with the effectively the excess pressure return line that's drilled into the crankcase in which this screws in. Now, it's quite well documented that on some examples the drain channel in the crankcase wasn't necessarily in the right position, and it was too far this way. So there are examples documented where if this isn't screwed in properly, and if you use a slightly thicker sealing washer, then the slightly incorrectly drilled drain channel in the crankcase would actually be up against the end thread here, and therefore oil pressure would bypass the valve. Now, in my case, I've checked the cases and measured them up against this, and it's absolutely fine. The drain channel is in exactly the right position if I install this with the recommended thin fibre washer. There's no problem with that at all. So the next thing you can also consider is, well, is the spring still in good condition? Well, this is from the A70, this one, and this oil pressure relief valve is a different part number to the A65, and is said to be running at a different pressure. But the trouble is, as far as I'm aware, there's no sort of amendment to the 1971 workshop manual or a 1972 workshop manual that includes the A70, whereby it gives you the specs for this oil pressure relief valve for the A70. However, what I've done recently as a comparison is I've managed to get hold of a brand new old stock A65, and of course the major components are the same, except for the A65 one, it had that rather coarse gauze, and on the A70 it's a very, very fine gauze, and in the workshop manual it does show you this coarse gauze for the A65. But here's your difference. So it's obvious that the A70 oil pressure relief valve works at a higher pressure. Now, I think off the top of my head, I think the A65 is somewhere around about 50 psi. I'll check it in a minute, but in that case, this is going to be running up somewhere near 70, I'd have thought. It's not such a stronger spring, but you can see at the length of it, it's going to be quite well compressed because the bodies and the caps are exactly the same. Let me just get the 1971 A65 workshop manual out and see if we've got the spec on what pressure that valve begins to release. Yeah, I was right, there you go. Relief valve blow-off pressure 50 psi. It's interesting that this still talks about a non-return valve ball of a 1/4 inch diameter, but say in later models that was changed to the piston, which we have here. But notice there's a spring-free length there of 812 thou, 812.5 thou. Let's just check that against this this new old stock spring here. Right, well that's not 812.5 thou, but having thought about this, then yeah, in this workshop manual it's talking about the slightly earlier oil pressure relief valve, which is based upon a ball bearing and not a piston. So therefore this is going to be a different spring. It's going to be slightly longer. So we can't tell whether, you know, that's a true length, but we know it came with this oil pressure relief valve, which is new old stock for A65, and this is unused, so it's got to be there or thereabouts. Now then, interestingly, the A70 is 1.5 inches, and I just had a thought, and I know that the triples run at a higher blow-off pressure, so I just checked the specs on an A75. And lo and behold, 1.5 inches, and the blow-off pressure is 17 to 90 pounds with oil at 80 degrees centigrade. So I'm going to hazard a guess that all they've done to change an A65 oil pressure relief valve into an A71 is put an A75 spring in it, and then the blow-off pressure is going to be the same. So in conclusion, I don't think there's anything wrong with the oil pressure relief valve, and I don't think there's anything wrong with the way that it seats into the crankcases. And again, if we look at the behaviour of the bike, where, you know, when it's cold, there's tons of oil pressure, the oil pressure warning light isn't on during tick over, but as the bike gets up to operating temperature, the oil pressure warning light starts to flicker on at tick over, and then starts to stay on for slightly higher revs, and latterly with the last test up to about 1500 revs or a little more, which gets a bit worrying then. And so the last thing to check then is the timing side main bearing, and there's quite a simple test to do on that. And remember, I did check and measure the tolerances on this when I rebuilt the motor, and also I checked that the journal on the crank was concentric as well, and it was all within tolerance. But let's have a look at it. Right, here we are then, showing you the crankshaft pinion. And you can see why, just on the left hand side, why I didn't show you the full shot of me having removed the timing side cases, and that's because just here on the pinion nut I've got some mole grips, and this is to allow me to see if I can demonstrate any up and down play in the crank. So there we go, that's better. Right, it's barely perceptible, but I can feel it. And you can probably hear it going clunk as I push down. So there's play, perceptible play in the main bearing. And I think it'll be probably more perceptible once I take off the pinion gear and the thrust washer here and the shims, because the end float on the crank on the A70 was changed from the A65, so it's shimmed externally of the crankcase, not internally. And there's a thrust washer here which is tight, quite tight against that, and I think that may be masking, you know, a bit of play in the crankshaft as well. Now, I know you're all saying, why the hell didn't you pick this up when you rebuilt the motor? And that's because I didn't measure everything up meticulously, and everything was within tolerances, and the crank journal was concentric as well. And all that I can imagine has happened is that I'm not a metallurgist or a material scientist. I'm actually a biomedical scientist, so that doesn't really help. But my thoughts on this would be that due to, you know, the previous catastrophic failure of the engine and all the intervening time when it's sat doing nothing, I'm just wondering whether, if you like, the integrity and the fabric and the structure, molecular structure of the original bearing has been compromised in some way, to the extent where, you know, initially when we were testing this motor, it had superb pressure, and in fact when you turned the engine off, you know, it held its pressure for a while before the oil pressure warning light came on. But obviously that's deteriorated and it's worn quite rapidly in the relatively few miles that I've done, and there's definitely perceptible play there now, which there wasn't before. So I think there's only one thing for it. It's going to be a strip, and I would rather do that than risk anything else, to be honest. You know, I've had lots of comments on this, and I'm grateful for everybody's comments and suggestions about what to look into, and I think we've covered everything off now. And I know it was a common problem with A65s that the oil pressure warning light would flicker or come on tick over, and you know, some people have said that their engines ran, you know, for many miles in that condition, and that in some cases people used to just remove the wire from the oil pressure warning light switch so they didn't have to worry about it. And I know plenty of people have said, you know, check the oil pressure with a gauge, and I've got the offer of a gauge as well if I want to, but I don't think there's any need to. There's play here. I can feel the play in the journal, and that means that will get progressively worse in an exponential way. So I'm going to strip the motor. So I think probably what that means is that we'll have a bit of a break from the A70, because it's taken up quite a bit of our time recently, and focus on other things, and maybe the first start on the Fury. But just before we finish off, let's just have a quick look at the differences on this side with respect to that main bearing, because it's not an A65 bearing. Okay, there's a shop many will recognise A65 timing side main bearing stroke bush, and as you can see this is marked up. This is minus 10 thou, which is what we'll need, but we will need to machine this because the A70 isn't as wide. The other dimensions with respect to the inner and outer diameter are correct. I'm not even sure if it has, you know, this slight flange on the A71 either, but it is thinner than that, and that's because of the larger crankshaft. Now, if you look at, let's try and get this pretty detailed. There's a bit of glare here, so let's try and get it without any glare or shadows. Hang on a sec. So there's the bush stroke main bearing. You can see it's compound, so steel on the outside, and then you've got the bronze on the inside. You can see there is a flange shown on this, but you can also see there the thrust washer there, and the shims that go in. The shims go in here. So certainly it's thinner on that side because we've got to allow for that thrust washer. And I think this flange it's thinner on this side as well, because not shown here is that there is a separate bronze thrust washer on this side that goes in on the inside of the crankcase that is separate to this bearing. So I don't know, if you look at relative proportions or whatever, we know we're going to need to machine it. But I mean, that doesn't matter really, because we've got the pattern in the bike, so we can get the correct sort of width dimensions from the one that's installed, the original one. We know that the IDs with respect to, you know, the standard and the reductions -10, -20 are the same as the A65, so we'll be able to use this, but we will need to turn this down once we get the old one out. So there we go.
Okay, so you can see that we've probably got to the bottom of why there's low oil pressure on the Lightning. So that just about concludes the video this time. So I'd like to say thank you to my associates, to
Erin
and to
Rachel.
And both Erin and Rachel have just been looking at the feature on the classic motorcycle video, which I know most of you have seen. And their favourite bikes out of the collection are... Rachel, what's your favourite bike?
The Fury
That's right. And what colour is that?
purple.
And what do you remember what the BSA factory called it? Plum Crazy. It's a bit of a funny name, isn't it? Because it's not really plum. And what's your favourite bike, Erin?
Rocket Free.
Very good. Yeah. Why do you like that?
Because I like the orange and the black.
Because it's the fastest, really. That's what you said before, isn't it? You're a speed king. Okay. So we'd like to say goodbye. So girls, say goodbye to everyone, and we'll see them all again soon.
Goodbye.
From
to our
Isla.
fans. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
That's
Bye.
it.
Bye. Bye.
That's quite a good shot, actually. I like that.
Bye.
Goodbye to us.
You sure you don't remember what goodbye is in Gaelic? I think that's disgraceful.
Do you know it?
No. I could ask my dad.